The Alpha King's cruel bride vanished for 7 years, then returned stronger than every Luna. The obsidian hall had no warmth in it, not in the stone walls, not in the torches that burned without flickering, not in the 300 wolves who stood in perfect silence watching Seraphine Vane walk toward the altar. She kept her chin level and her eyes forward, and she did not look at the man waiting for her at the end of the aisle because she already knew what she would find there. Nothing. A king who did not want her. A ceremony that had nothing to do with either of them, and everything to do with a debt her father had left behind when he died. She was 22 years old. She had buried her father 6 weeks ago. She had packed everything she owned into one trunk, said goodbye to the people of the Vane pack who looked at her like she was already gone, and walked into a carriage that smelled like pine resin and cold iron. Now she was here, in a hall that could have swallowed her entire home village, wearing a dress the color of winter ash, walking toward a king who had not once asked for her name before accepting her as tribute. His name was Selim Drak. He was the Alpha King of the Drak realm, which covered more land than most people could travel in a season. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a face that was built for authority the way some faces are built for kindness. He watched her walk toward him with the expression of a man signing a document, measured, efficient, complete. She reached the altar. She stood beside him. He still did not look at her. The High Elder of the court began speaking. Words about alliance, words about blood, words about the sacred bond between a king and the woman chosen to stand beside him. Seraphine listened to every word and held herself still and breathed through the weight of understanding, clearly and without softening it, that not one person in this room cared whether she lived or died. They cared about what her presence here represented: a settled debt, a closed chapter, a line drawn through a name on a list somewhere. When the moment came for the vows, Selim turned to face her for the first time. His eyes were the color of deep water in winter, not cold exactly, just very, very far away. He spoke his vows in a clear, even voice. He did not stumble over a single word. He did not look away from her face once, which was not the same as actually seeing her. She had learned that distinction early. There was a kind of looking that meant nothing. She had grown up in a pack where her father's word was law and her mother's silence was its own kind of testimony, and she knew the difference between being seen and being observed. Selim Drak was observing her the way a man observes the weather. Noting it, accounting for it, moving on. When it was her turn, she spoke clearly. She said every word the ceremony required. She kept her voice steady. She did not let a single tremor through, not even when she felt the bond between them settle into place like a lock clicking shut on a door she hadn't opened. The bond was real. It was always real. That was the hardest part about being wolf-born. You could not lie to the bond. It registered everything. She registered him, a vast, contained, guarded thing with walls built so high she couldn't see the top of them. Whether he registered anything from her side, he gave no sign. The elder pronounced them bound. The hall made a sound that was almost applause, almost celebration. The torches did not flicker. Selim offered her his arm for the walk back down the aisle. She took it because protocol required it. His arm was like taking hold of something carved from a mountainside. She kept her hand light on his sleeve and walked at exactly his pace and looked straight ahead, and in her mind she was already doing what she always did in new and threatening places. She was counting exits. 3 doors in the hall itself, 1 behind the dais, 2 flanking the main entrance, windows too high to reach without a step. The stone floor was polished enough to skid on if she needed to move fast, so she noted that too. Her mother, a healer from the outer border territories, had taught her this. Map your room before you need to leave it. Know where the air comes in before you need to breathe. The wedding supper was long. She sat beside Selim at the head table and ate what was placed in front of her and spoke when addressed, and said nothing that could be remembered or used. People came to pay their respects to the new Luna Queen. She smiled at each one. A council member with a white-streaked beard and sharp, calculating eyes introduced himself as Elder Prentice and looked at her the way a buyer looks at something purchased at a discount, noting what was missing, noting what seemed cheaper than expected. She filed his name away behind her eyes. After the supper, after the toasts, after the music and the endless procession of faces she would need to learn to identify, 2 female attendants led her to a set of chambers in the west wing of the palace. The rooms were large. The furniture was fine. There were flowers on the table which surprised her. She touched 1 petal. It was real. She sat on the edge of the bed and waited. After an hour, she stopped waiting. She unpacked her trunk herself because she had not asked for help and she preferred it that way. She found the small shelf of books she had brought. She found the folded blanket her mother had woven, deep green and soft from years of use, and she spread it over the palace bed. She found the small leather journal she had carried since she was 15 and set it on the bedside table and put her pen beside it. She did not write in it that night. She sat at the window instead and looked out at the grounds below, which were vast and dark and lit only by the perimeter lamps, and she let herself feel, honestly and without flinching, how completely alone she was. She had learned that this was the only way to manage it. You could not outrun aloneness. You had to sit with it and let it pass through you like cold water until your body understood it wasn't going to kill you. It wasn't going to kill her. She was still sitting there when the first pale light came into the sky. The next morning, a servant knocked at her door and delivered a message. The message was written on palace stationery in a precise, controlled hand. It was from Selim. It was not a good morning. It was a list. 6 items. The first said that meals would be served in the main dining hall at specific hours and that her presence at the morning meal was expected on days when council sessions were scheduled. The second outlined which areas of the palace were accessible to her freely and which required prior arrangement. The third noted that she would be assigned a formal attendant within the week. The fourth addressed correspondence. Any letters received by her would be opened and reviewed by the palace secretary before delivery, as was standard protocol for all court members. The fifth informed her that her introduction to the court nobility would take place at the harvest reception in 3 weeks. The sixth said, "I trust the chambers are adequate. If there are specific requirements for your comfort, present them to the household steward." She read the list twice. She set it on the desk. She went to find the dining hall for breakfast, which was 3 wrong turns and 1 correct one, and when she arrived, the meal was just ending and the kitchen staff looked uncertain about whether to clear the table or set a new place for her. She told them not to trouble themselves and ate standing at the kitchen counter, which scandalized a junior cook and delighted an elderly woman who was peeling vegetables and who handed her a warm roll without being asked. She ate the roll and said thank you and went to find the library. There was an official library on the 2nd floor of the main palace wing. It was large, well organized, and occupied by 2 council scribes who looked up when she entered, and then looked back down at their work with the careful neutrality of people who had been instructed not to engage with her unnecessarily. She browsed for 40 minutes, chose 2 books, one on the geography of the outer territories and one on the history of the Drac realm's border wars, and left. She found the 2nd library by accident on the 4th day. She had taken a wrong corridor in the east wing, following what turned out to be a dead end, and noticed that the door at the very end of the corridor wasn't locked. It opened into a room that smelled of dust and old paper, cool and dim, with shelves that went up higher than the light reached, and a table near the window that was covered in a layer of fine dust, except for one corner where someone had clearly worked at some point years ago. There was a chair with a cracked leather cushion. There were maps on the far wall, pinned crookedly. There was a sense of abandonment so complete it felt almost peaceful. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she stepped inside and closed the door quietly behind her. She did not tell anyone about the room. She didn't know why exactly, except that it felt like the first thing in this palace that had not been presented to her with some kind of condition attached. The first 2 weeks moved like water moving through stone slowly with pressure wearing away at the edges of things she had assumed were solid. She attended the meals she was required to attend. She wore what the attendant assigned to her, a woman named Portia, efficient and kind in a careful way, like kindness kept on a short leash laid out for her each morning. She learned faces and names. She sat in on a council session because she was permitted to, and because she wanted to understand the machinery of the realm she had been brought into. Selim ran the council with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, complete, measured, absolutely impersonal. He listened to reports, asked precise questions, and made decisions with a speed that told her he had already considered all the angles before anyone spoke. He was very good at this. She could see that clearly. He was a man who was extraordinarily competent at the specific and limited thing he allowed himself to be, which was a king in the political and strategic sense, and who had walled off everything else. He spoke to her 3 times in those first 2 weeks, once to confirm she had received the household steward's introduction, once across a crowded reception room to ask if she had found the library. She said yes, thinking of the official one, and he said something about the collection being newly reorganized and moved on. Once in the corridor outside the council chamber where he passed her coming in as she was leaving, And he said her name, Seraphine, the way you say a word in a language you've learned technically but never spoken aloud, slightly careful, slightly like reading. At the end of the second week, she attended a private dinner with 6 of the council members and their partners. It was meant to be social. It was a test, and everyone at the table knew it was a test, and she was expected to perform well enough to not embarrass the king she had been attached to. She wore deep blue. She spoke when spoken to, and steered conversations with the gentle precision of someone who had grown up watching her mother navigate the politics of a healer's relationship with a pack alpha's ego. She was good at this too. She was perhaps better at it than anyone at the table expected. Elder Prentice was there. He sat 3 seats down from her. He watched her with those sharp eyes all evening, and near the end of the meal, when the conversation had turned to the matter of the northern border territories and their recent trade agreements, he spoke across the table to her directly. "The Vane pack had connections in the northern territories, did they not?" he said. His tone was perfectly polite. The weapon was in the word connections, which he used the way you might use the word rumors, implying looseness, implying something not quite legitimate. The table went quiet. Seraphine looked at him. She said calmly, "My mother practiced medicine in the northern border camps for 8 years. The Vane pack supplied the outer territories with field medicines and healing knowledge for 3 generations. Yes, there were connections." She picked up her glass. She took a calm sip. "Is there something specific about the northern territories you'd like to know?" she asked. "I may be able to help." The silence stretched 1 beat too long, and then a council member's partner, a warm-faced woman named Delia who had been quietly pleasant all evening, laughed with what seemed like genuine delight and changed the subject, and the table relaxed. Seraphine set her glass down and did not look at Elder Prentice again for the rest of the meal. She did not need to. She had done what she needed to do. She had made it clear without raising her voice or lowering herself that the thing he was pointing at, her origin, her bloodline, the fallen name of Vane, was not something she was ashamed of. That was what he had been testing for, shame. He hadn't found it. She saw Selim watching her from the far end of the table as she did this. His face told her nothing. His eyes stayed on her for exactly 4 seconds, and then he turned to the council member on his left and continued a conversation she couldn't hear. She wondered, not for the first time and not with any particular feeling attached to it, what he was thinking. She concluded, as she had concluded before, that it probably didn't matter. That night she went back to the East Wing library and lit the lamp on the table and sat in the cracked leather chair and opened her journal and wrote for 2 hours. She wrote about the dinner. She wrote about Elder Prentice's tone and the precise calibration of contempt in it. She wrote about Delia's laugh and what it felt like to receive unexpected kindness. She wrote about the Northern Territories map on the wall and how she kept returning to it during her visits to this room. She did not write about Selim. There was nothing to write. He was an absence with authority, a shape where warmth refused to form. She wrote at the very bottom of the page, "I am going to need more than this." She capped the pen. She looked at the map on the wall. The outer territories were marked in pale ink, faded now, the borders shifting with age. She traced one edge with her finger without touching it, just following the line through the air. She closed the journal. She blew out the lamp. She went back to her rooms in the dark, counting her steps, mapping her way without light, because she had already learned the path well enough to walk it with her eyes closed. In the weeks that followed, the palace settled into a kind of rhythm around her, or perhaps she settled into a kind of rhythm within it. She was not entirely sure which. She attended the public functions and the required meals and the 3 council sessions per month that she was permitted to observe. She completed the formal introduction to court nobility at the harvest reception and moved through the evening like water through a net, leaving no single impression strong enough to be grabbed hold of. Portia, her attendant, began relaxing around her after the 3rd week. Small signs. She would ask Seraphine's opinion on which dress to lay out rather than simply deciding. She would mention small pieces of court gossip in a casual way that suggested she had determined Seraphine could be trusted with them. Once she laughed at something Seraphine said, genuinely, startled into it, and then looked slightly alarmed at herself, and Seraphine pretended not to notice so that it could happen again. Selim remained exactly as he had been on the day she arrived, precise, contained. Present in the room without ever being available in it. She began to think of him as a lighthouse. You could see the light. You could navigate by it. You could not live inside it. She watched him in the council sessions. She listened to how he reasoned. He was thorough, unsentimental, and genuinely concerned with the welfare of the realm in the way that a very good engineer is genuinely concerned with the integrity of a bridge, not with feeling but with function. When a report came in about 3 outer villages suffering from a lack of medical supplies after a trade route disruption, he had the problem solved within 48 hours, efficiently, correctly, without ever having been in one of those villages or spoken to one of those people. She thought about her mother, who had walked the border camps in worn boots for 8 years, who knew the names of every healer in the outer territories, who had once stayed awake for 3 days at the bedside of a child with a fever that no one expected to break. Her mother, who had died when Seraphine was 17, quietly and without fuss, in the same way she had done everything. Seraphine thought, there are different ways of doing the right thing. She was not sure yet which kind she was meant to be. She was sure of very little in those weeks, except for a small number of things she had known since before she came here and which had not changed. She was capable, she was patient. She was not breakable, though she understood breakable things better than most people because she had held enough of them in her hands. And she was here in this palace, in this life, for reasons that had nothing to do with love or choice, and she had decided not with drama, not with grief, but with the same quiet clarity with which she made all her decisions, that she was going to find something worth building inside of it. The question was whether anything in this palace was going to let her. 4 weeks after the wedding, there was a dinner in the Great Hall for a visiting delegation from the Eastern Reaches. 12 guests in addition to the court regulars, long table, many candles, Selim at the head, Seraphine at his right hand as her position required. She sat and spoke and managed the social mechanics of the evening with the practiced ease she was developing, and then the alpha who led the visiting delegation, a large man named Goran, loud in the way that men are loud when they are accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room they enter, turned the conversation toward her in a way that was not curiosity. It was something else. He asked where she was from. She told him. He tilted his head and said, in the particular tone that is almost not an insult, "Vane. That name has some history to it, doesn't it?" It was not a question. The history he was referring to was her father's debt, the scandal of a pack that had fallen, the disgrace that was attached to her name like a second shadow. She felt the table hold its breath. She said clearly, every name has history, some of it is worth carrying. She picked up her fork. What brings the Eastern delegation to court this season? The border agreements, I understand, or is this more of a social visit? She redirected the conversation with such smooth ease that Goran found himself talking about Eastern trade routes before he had fully processed what had just happened. The table breathed again. She ate her meal. But she had noticed the moment before she redirected it. The moment where the table waited silently to see whether the king at the head of it would say something, whether he would speak, whether he would do the thing that every person in that room knew a husband did when someone dismissed his wife's name at his own table. Selim had not spoken. He had lifted his wine glass, he had taken a measured drink, he had looked at neither Goran nor Seraphine. He had let it pass. She had handled it herself, so nothing had broken open in front of the guests. But the thing she had registered, that precise 4-second window of his silence that stayed with her when she walked back to her rooms afterward, she did not feel hurt by it. She did not feel angry. She felt something colder and more useful, which was clarity. She understood now exactly the terms of what she had entered into. She sat in the East Wing library for a long time that night and looked at the map and thought. She thought about her mother's boots, worn thin at the heel. She thought about the 3 generations of Vane healers who had gone where they were needed and been largely invisible while they worked. She thought about the exits she had counted on the day she arrived and how she had been counting them in every room since. She thought how long. Not dramatically, not with tears or with resolution or with any particular ceremony. Just the clean, practical question of a woman who has always believed that any problem honestly assessed has a length to it, a duration. Things that feel permanent are almost never permanent. How long, she asked herself. She did not have an answer yet, but she had begun to look for one, which was, for Seraphine Vane, the same thing as beginning to move. The second month was worse than the first, and the third month was worse than the second, and she understood this was not accidental. It was not that Selim was cruel in any particular moment. It was that he was consistently, reliably, architecturally absent, and that absence over time built something in the air between them that was heavier than cruelty would have been. Cruelty, she had learned from the books she read in the East Wing library, required engagement. It required a person to look at you and decide to do something to you. What Selim practiced was more efficient than that. He simply never turned toward her. He never entered the room she was already in and chose to sit near her. He never asked a question that required a real answer. He was not unkind. He was not anything. She woke up on the first morning of the third month and sat on the edge of the palace bed with the green blanket her mother had made folded neatly at its foot, and she thought, "This is what it feels like to be furniture." She did not allow herself to feel sorry about it for more than the length of that morning. Then she got up, dressed herself, and went to find something useful to do with the day. This was becoming her method. When the palace threatened to close around her like a fist, she moved. She found things to learn. She found people who needed practical help and offered it quietly without making a performance of it. In the fourth week of the second month, she discovered that the palace had a small medicinal herb garden behind the kitchens that had been neglected for years. 3 of its most useful plants had died from improper drainage, and the gardener, an older man named Saul who had worked the palace grounds for decades, was too proud to admit he didn't know enough about medicinal plants to fix it. She didn't announce herself. She simply arrived one morning with her mother's handwritten notes on drainage requirements for marsh sage and silverroot, and she sat beside Saul on an upturned pot and showed him the diagrams, and he listened with the careful attention of someone who respects competence in any form, and within a week the drainage had been corrected and 2 new cuttings were taking root. Saul brought her a jar of preserved blackberries from the kitchen stores after that, left outside her door without a note. She ate them with bread 2 mornings running and thought about how gratitude, when it was real, never needed to be loud. Portia brought her other small pieces of the palace's inner life, the kind of information that didn't circulate at council sessions or formal dinners. She learned that the eastern wing had been closed off years ago after the death of someone who had lived there. Portia was vague on the details, and Seraphine did not press. She learned that Elder Prentice had been the primary voice in favor of the arrangement between her father's pack and the king, which meant he had been instrumental in bringing her here, which meant his contempt for her was possibly the contempt a person feels for evidence of their own choices. She filed this away. She learned in a piece of quiet that arrived between Portia laying out a dress and leaving the room that the king had been formally presented with 3 potential matches before her, all of higher political standing, and had accepted none of them. She had been the 4th option, offered by the council as a practical resolution to the Vane debt, and he had accepted her in the same session without deliberation, between 2 other items of council business. She was not sure why this information settled into her the way it did, not with pain, with something more like orientation, a bearing. She had been trying to understand what she was to him in this equation, and now she knew, an administrative resolution, a line of business cleared. She said nothing about this to Portia. She thanked her for the dress and asked a question about the harvest festival schedule, and Portia answered it, and the moment passed. But at night, in the East Wing library, she wrote about it. She wrote honestly and without softening the edges, because the journal was the one place in the palace where she permitted herself the full weight of things. She wrote, "I was the path of least resistance." And she had chosen the path of least resistance to accommodate me, which is not the same as choosing me at all. She capped the pen, she looked at the map. The third month brought a set of events that would have been difficult even under generous circumstances, and the circumstances in the palace were not generous. A delegation came from the Northern Territories, 3 packs, all with long-standing relationships to the Vane name, all expecting to meet the woman who was now Luna Queen and to find in her someone who could speak for their interests at the court level. They had heard she was one of them in some essential way. They had come with hope. The meeting was formal, managed by the palace protocol officer, and Seraphine sat at the correct position in the room and listened and was pleasant and was, by all the rules of court procedure, appropriately present. But she had no actual authority in the room. She was an ornamental position. She could not commit to anything. She could not promise anything. When the Northern delegation's lead speaker, a gray-haired woman named Orin who had known Seraphine's mother, looked at her across the table with something that was almost a question, Seraphine could only hold her gaze and offer the smallest possible signal with her eyes, a blink that said, "I know. I cannot say it here. I know." After the delegation left, she went to Selim. This was not easy. She had not sought him out before in a direct way. She had not gone to his study or his council office or anywhere that was clearly his ground rather than shared ground. She did it now because she had decided that doing it was necessary, and she had learned by this point that when she decided something was necessary, Waiting did not make it less necessary. She knocked, his secretary opened the door, looked uncertain, and then Selim's voice from inside said to let her in. He was at his desk, papers, maps, the organized machinery of a kingdom spread before him. He looked up. He did not look surprised to see her. He looked as if he had been expecting this at some point and was mildly interested to find it happening now. She said, standing in the doorway because he had not invited her to sit, "The Northern Territories delegation. They have real concerns about the border supply agreements, specifically the medical trade route disruption that's been unresolved for 3 months. I have connections there. I have knowledge that could be useful. I would like to be involved in the follow-up." He looked at her for a moment. "The Northern Territories matter is being handled by the Council's Trade Committee." "The Council's Trade Committee has not been to the Northern Territories," she said. "I have. My mother's work covered 4 of the 7 border camps. I know the specific points where the current agreement is failing and why." He was quiet for a moment. He picked up a pen, he set it down. He said, "I'll note your interest to the committee chair." She recognized very clearly what this was. It was neither yes nor no. It was the administrative equivalent of a door that opened without taking you anywhere. She said thank you because she had been raised to say it, and because saying it cost her nothing and told him nothing. She turned to leave. "Seraphine." She stopped, she turned back. He was looking at her with that same quality of attention, complete but unreachable. He said, "You speak well in those meetings, the court has noticed." She waited, thinking there would be something else. There wasn't. She said good night and left. She walked back through the palace corridors and up the stairs and along the East Wing passage and into the hidden library, and she sat in the cracked leather chair, and she put both hands flat on the table, and she held them there and breathed until the thing in her chest, which was not grief, not anger, something older and heavier than both, settled back to a manageable level. He had noticed. He had told her he had noticed. That was what he had offered, and he had offered it with perfect sincerity, and it was so far from what she needed that the distance between them was almost funny. Almost. The first formal reception of the winter season came in the 7th week of the 3rd month. It was the largest social event she had attended since the wedding. 200 guests, the full court, nobles from 4 of the 5 major territories, and the visiting alpha that Selim had been in trade negotiations with for 2 months. His name was Gideon, and he was from the Western Coast Territories, and he was the kind of person who took up exactly as much space as he was entitled to and not a fraction more, which she found immediately refreshing after weeks of men who took up everything. The evening began well. She moved through it with the ease she had developed over the past months, and the ease was real now, not performed. She had learned enough faces and names and territorial relationships to actually be useful in these rooms. She connected a merchant from the south with a trade possibility he hadn't considered. She answered a question about northern border geography that no one else at the table could answer accurately. She made Delia, the council wife who had laughed at the dinner weeks ago, laugh again, and this time Delia touched her arm briefly as she laughed, which was the closest thing to warmth that had come from within this court. And then, near the end of the evening, when the candles had burned low and the guests had separated into smaller clusters, she heard Elder Prentice speaking to 2 men across the room. She did not intend to hear it. She was passing behind them to reach the door to the outer corridor. But the room had gone briefly quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet, and his voice carried clearly. He was speaking about her. The words were not shouted. They were the considered, private-seeming words of a man who has decided something and is saying it to people he trusts. He spoke about her bloodline. He used the phrase unfortunate necessity. He used words that were precise in the way that careful insults always are, nothing you could pin down as a direct attack, everything you needed to understand his meaning. She stopped walking. She was behind him and he did not see her. She stood perfectly still for 3 seconds, 4 or 5. She turned and looked at Selim, who was 6 feet away, speaking to Gideon. He was close enough to have heard. The conversation in the room had been quiet enough. His ears, like all wolf-born, were sharp enough. He continued speaking to Gideon. He did not turn. He did not glance toward Elder Prentice. He said something that made Gideon smile, and he reached for his glass, and he was completely, absolutely, deliberately elsewhere. She had thought she was ready for this. She had thought she had prepared for the full range of what this life offered. She had sat in that East Wing library night after night and worked through the arithmetic of her situation and arrived at conclusions that felt durable. She had believed herself past surprise. She had not been past it. She simply had not found the exact shape of the thing that would get through until now. She walked out of the reception hall. She walked through the outer corridor. She walked up the stairs and through the east wing passage and into the hidden library, and she stood in the middle of the room in the dark without lighting the lamp, and she let the thing inside her finish arriving. It was not heartbreak, she was clear on that. You could not have your heart broken by a man who had never held it. What it was, she thought, standing in the dark library with the faded maps she couldn't see around her, was something closer to the end of a question. She had been asking quietly, without articulating it fully even to herself, whether there was going to be something here worth staying for, whether the cold architecture of this life had a room in it that contained warmth, whether he was a person who was capable of something more than the very limited, competent, impersonal thing he allowed himself to be. She had the answer now. She stood in the dark for a long time. Then she lit the lamp, sat down at the table, opened the journal, and wrote for 1 hour without stopping. She wrote without anger because anger required hope, and she had finished with hope. She wrote with the precision of a person who is making a record, not processing a feeling. She wrote, "I have understood the terms completely. I know now what this place offers and what it does not offer, and I know what I am going to do." She capped the pen, she stood. She looked at the map on the wall, the outer territories, faded, the borders shifting, the wide open land beyond this palace and this court and this life that was not hers. Her mother had walked those roads in worn boots. Her mother had known where the light came from before she needed to find it. Seraphine blew out the lamp. She did not go to sleep. She sat in the dark and she thought about the 3 things she would take. She had already, she realized, known exactly what they were. It was still dark when she moved. She had not slept, she had not tried. She had sat in the cracked leather chair in the East Wing library until she was certain, not angry certain, not desperate certain, but the clean and steady and weightless kind of certain that comes from having made a decision you know is correct. And then she stood up and did each thing that needed to be done in the order it needed to be done. She went back to her rooms. She changed into her traveling clothes, dark trousers, a thick wool coat, boots that her mother had given her before she died, still good, the leather reinforced at the toe. She had kept them in the palace wardrobe unworn because palace floors did not require them. She laced them now and stood up and felt for the first time in 3 months that her feet were on the right surface. She went to the small chest at the bottom of the wardrobe. She had known since the 2nd week what she would take, but she went through the exercise of confirming it because she was not someone who left things to instinct when a moment of patience was available. The first thing was her mother's ring, a simple band of dark metal with a small rough stone set into it, not valuable by any standard the court would recognize, valuable beyond calculation by her own. She put it on her right hand where she had worn it before the palace wedding required a different ring on that finger. The second thing was the book of border maps from the East Wing library. She had not borrowed it. She had taken it the previous week with the intention of returning it, knowing she would not return it, acknowledging this honestly in the category of small necessary dishonest things. The maps were the outer territories in detail that no map available elsewhere had. She had spent 3 months learning them. They were hers now in the way that knowledge, once absorbed, becomes inseparable from the person who carries it. The third thing was a name, not an object. A name Portia had mentioned in passing 2 weeks ago, the name of her sister, who lived in the free territories east of the Drac Realm's border, who ran a field healing station near the Coldmore Pass. Portia had mentioned it once without significance, and Seraphine had written it in the back of her journal and said nothing. The name was Lily, the place was Coldmore. She put the journal in her coat's inner pocket. She put the map book in the bag she had packed with the same clothes she had arrived with. She was not taking anything the palace had given her, which was a decision that cost her nothing practical and meant something she didn't need to explain to herself. She did not write a note for Selim. She had considered it and decided against it. He had not asked for her. He would not look for her. Any note she left would become a document in the palace records. She owed him nothing. She was in the legal sense his Luna, but a Luna who is never consulted, never defended, never present in any genuine sense to the man she is bound to is already a kind of ghost. She was simply making the haunting official. She left the ring from the wedding ceremony on the desk in her chambers. She placed it on top of his first list, the 6 items, the things she was required to do, the shape of the life he had assigned her, and she set it precisely in the center, and she looked at it once and she left. The palace at this hour was not entirely unguarded, but it was minimally staffed in the East Wing, which she knew because she had been counting the movements of the night staff for the past 2 weeks with the same calm attention she brought to everything else. She went down the east wing staircase, and through the corridor that ran behind the herb garden and out the small door that the gardening staff used for early morning supply deliveries, which had a latch that required no key from the inside. The air outside hit her like cold water in the best possible way. She breathed it in deeply. She stood for exactly 3 seconds in the pre-dawn dark of the palace grounds, orienting herself with the map she had memorized, placing herself on it. The Eastern Road, the Coldmoor Pass, Lily. She started walking. By the time the first light came into the sky, she was off the palace grounds and onto the trade road. By the time the palace bells would have rung for the morning meal she was required to attend on council session days, she was 2 hours east and moving steadily through the pale gold of an early winter morning, her mother's boots solid under her feet, the map in her head unwinding with each step. She did not look back. This was not a performance of not looking back. She genuinely did not need to. She had looked at that palace from every window in the East Wing library for 3 months. She had memorized it thoroughly enough. What was behind her was completely known. What was ahead was the entire point. The trade road was quiet at this hour. A cart passed her going the other direction, a farmer heading to the morning market, who glanced at her and nodded and asked no questions because people on roads before dawn are generally understood to be minding their own business and are owed the same courtesy. She nodded back. She kept walking. She reached the first village by mid-morning. It was a small place, 12 or 15 houses, a well, a shop. She bought bread and dried fruit with the coins she had been quietly setting aside, her personal allowance from the palace, which was generous enough that she had spent very little of it, and saved the rest without drawing attention to the saving. She ate walking. The cold was not unfriendly. It was the dry, clean cold of open country, not the damp indoor cold of stone corridors. She had spent most of her life in outdoor and border territory climates. This felt, against all reasonable expectation, like something being returned to her. She did not allow herself to feel euphoric about this. She was practical enough to know that euphoria was what you felt in the first hours of a decision, before the actual consequences arrived. She was 3 months away from the last time she had slept on anything other than a palace bed. She was heading toward a field station run by a woman she had never met, with coins that would not last forever and no formal plan beyond reach Coldmoor, find Lily. She was also undeniably free. Not free in the complete sense. The bond existed. She could feel it faintly at the edge of her awareness, a thread leading back in the direction she had come from, not painful but present. She would deal with the bond as a practical matter when she understood better what it required. Right now she knew only that it did not compel her. She was wolf-born but not a wolf who had given her alpha instincts over to anyone else. And Selim Drak, whatever else he was, had never bothered to establish the kind of connection that would give him any genuine claim on her direction. She walked. The road opened up past the village into farmland, wide and flat and grey-brown with the end of autumn, the hedgerows stripped to their skeletons, the sky large and pale and full of moving light. She walked through it and breathed it and did not think too far ahead, because far ahead was where fear lived, and she was not interested in giving it an address. She thought instead about her mother. Her mother had left her own home pack at 20, which Seraphine had always known in the way you know facts about people you love, with the information present but without the weight of it, because when you are a child, the person your parent was before you existed feels like a story rather than a reality. Now on this road she thought about it with new understanding. She thought about what her mother must have felt in those first hours on the road, the cold air, the practical reckoning, the uncertain distance. Had she been afraid? She must have been. She had been human enough for that. But she had gone anyway, and she had walked into border camps where no one knew her name, and she had made herself useful, and she had built a life out of nothing but competence and willingness to show up, and she had done it in places that needed her and asked no questions about where she came from. Seraphine thought, I am my mother's daughter. It was the most hopeful thought she'd had in 3 months, and she let herself have it without apology. By nightfall she was at the edge of the outer territories, according to her map. She found shelter at a wayfarer's inn, a small, low-ceilinged place run by a woman who looked at her with neither curiosity nor suspicion, and showed her a room and brought her a bowl of bean soup without being asked, which was the kind of hospitality that exists in places where travelers are common and expected, and their business is their own. She ate, she slept, She slept better than she had in 3 months. In the morning, she asked the innkeeper's wife about the road to Coldmoor Pass. The woman told her, 3 days on the east road, then north for half a day on the track that ran alongside the old river. There was a field station there. The woman nodded as if this was known, run by a healer. Good people out that way, the woman said. Seraphine thanked her and paid for the room and the meal and left. 3 days, she could do 3 days. She had her mother's boots and her mother's ring and her mother's maps, and the sum total of 3 months of learning to hold herself together in conditions that were not designed for her. 3 days on a road that was taking her somewhere rather than keeping her somewhere was not a hardship. She walked. On the second day, the road narrowed and the farmland gave way to forest, and the cold deepened, and she found herself, for the first time since leaving the palace, genuinely cold in the physical way that required her to pay attention. She pulled the wool coat tighter and kept her pace steady, and watched the road ahead of her with the careful attention of someone who is learning how to see the world at walking pace, which is slower and more detailed than any other pace. She saw a hawk above the tree line. She saw frost on the underside of a fallen branch. She saw, near the road's edge, the tracks of something large and wolf-shaped that turned away from the road and into the trees, and she felt the hair on her arms rise briefly and then settle, because the tracks were old and the animal was gone and the forest was quiet. She ate dried fruit and bread and river water from a stream she crossed near midday. She found a dry spot under a rock overhang on the second night and slept in her coat with the bag for a pillow, which was not comfortable, which was completely manageable. On the third morning, she rose before light and walked north on the track beside the river. The field station appeared in the late afternoon. She smelled it before she saw its smoke and something medicinal, and the particular smell of bandages and camp life that she associated with her earliest memories of her mother's work. She stopped walking when she saw it through the trees, a cluster of low buildings, a fire in the open center, 3 figures moving between them. She stood at the edge of the tree line. She was, she acknowledged, slightly more tired than she had expected. She was also, she acknowledged, slightly less certain than she had expected now that she had arrived. Arrival was always like this. The walking was certain. The arriving required something different. She thought of her mother. She thought of the first border camp, the first pack, the first stranger who had looked at her mother and not known whether to trust her, and how her mother had simply begun doing what needed doing and let that speak for itself. She stepped out of the trees and walked toward the fire. One of the figures looked up, a woman, perhaps 30, with her hair pinned back and her sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold. She looked at Seraphine with neither alarm nor welcome, just attention. The clean assessment of someone who evaluates strangers in terms of what they need. Seraphine said, "My name is Seraphine. My mother was Vane the healer. I've been told Lily works here." The woman looked at her for a moment, then she said, "I'm Lily." Seraphine exhaled. It was a very small exhale. She kept it contained. She said, "I can set bones and treat field wounds. I know marsh sage and silverroot and 4 other border territory medicinal plants by sight and by application. I don't need paying. I need a place to be useful." Lily looked at her for another moment. She looked at the bag. She looked at the boots. She looked at Seraphine's face with the specific thoroughness of someone who has learned to read what people don't say. "Come in," she said. "There's soup." Seraphine walked toward the fire. Behind her, the palace was 3 days away in every sense of the word. Ahead of her was a camp, a fire, a bowl of soup, and the first morning of whatever she was going to build from here. She walked into the light of the fire, and the door of the station opened, and the warmth came out to meet her. She had not known until that moment how cold she had been. The first year was the hardest, and she was grateful for that, because hardness required full attention, and full attention left no room for the other thing, the thing that waited at the edges of quiet moments, the weight of what she had left and what had been left behind, and all the things that had and hadn't been said in 3 months in a palace that had never quite agreed to contain her. She worked. This was the structure that saved her, and she understood it was saving her, which meant she could use it deliberately rather than simply falling into it. She worked in the field station under Lily's supervision, and gradually without it, as it became clear that Seraphine knew more than she had implied on the day she arrived, and that Lily was the kind of person who respected competence enough to get out of its way. The patients were border territory wolves and humans alike. The outer camps drew from both populations, because injury and illness observed no pack boundaries. She had known this abstractly. Living it was different. She sat with a human farmer one evening while he recovered from a bone infection that had come within a day of killing him, and she listened to him talk about his children, and she thought about what it meant to be outside the pack system entirely, to have no alpha, no bond, no social architecture that existed specifically to hold you, and how these people had built something anyway, out of common need and daily proximity, and the fact of existing in the same place and needing the same things. She thought about this a great deal in that first year. Lily was good company in the way that competent, self-possessed people are good company. She did not perform warmth, but warmth was present in her actions in a way that mattered more. She brought Seraphine extra blankets on the first cold night without being asked. She explained the station's record system with the patience of someone who understands that knowing a thing yourself and transferring that knowledge to someone else are entirely different skills. She never asked about the palace. She never asked about the bond. After 2 weeks, Seraphine understood that Lily was not incurious. She simply understood that people arrived at the Coldmoor station because they needed to arrive somewhere, and that asking them to justify their arrival was unkind. Portia sent a letter in the 6th week. Seraphine received it with a feeling that took her a moment to identify, not dread, not longing, but the particular tension of hearing a sound from a room you have left and wondering whether to go back. She sat with the letter in her hands for a few minutes before opening it. It was brief. Portia did not report on the palace or the king. She said that she hoped Seraphine had found safety and warmth. She said she had thought in the weeks since her departure that she had not said enough of the things she meant while she had the chance, and that she was sorry for this. She said one other thing, and Seraphine read it twice. Whatever they say about you here, I know what I saw. Seraphine folded the letter into the journal. She wrote Portia back. She kept the letter short and did not give an address, not because she didn't trust Portia, but because she was not ready to be findable. She said, I am well, I am working, thank you for what you said. She did not ask what they were saying. She could guess, and guessing was sufficient. She was the Luna Queen who had run, the woman who had abandoned her duty, the disgraced bride. She had spent enough time in the palace to understand that the story of a woman who leaves will always be shaped by the people who remain, and that the shaping will rarely favor the woman. She found that she did not particularly mind. This surprised her slightly. She had thought she might mind that somewhere beneath the clarity of her leaving was a wound that would respond to imagined judgment. But the gap between who she was and who any court story could make her was wide enough now that the distance felt like protection rather than loss. They could make her into whatever the story required. She was out here in the cold, learning to pack a wound cavity and negotiate with a suspicious outer pack elder and keep a field station's medicine supplies from running out before the trade cart came. She was, daily and in practice, becoming someone. The bond was present all through that first year, faint and undemanding at the edges. It did not hurt. She had not expected it to hurt in a physical way, but she had expected it to pull, to create some gravitational drag back in the direction of the palace. What it actually did was simpler and stranger. It was like a sound you stop consciously hearing after long enough, but that you would notice immediately if it disappeared. She was aware of it the way she was aware of her own heartbeat. It was there. It was continuous. And whatever it was registering from the other end, Selim Drak did not act on it. No one came for her. This did not surprise her. She had known it would be this way. She had counted on it the same way she counted exits, not with hope that she would need them, just with the practical certainty of knowing they were there. He had let her be invisible in his palace. He let her be invisible in his world. She was consistent, which was the only thing she had ever expected from him. By the 6th month she was trusted enough at the station that Lily began sending her out to the smaller camps in the surrounding area alone. This required navigation, negotiation, and the ability to walk into a group of strangers who had not asked for her and establish within minutes that she was not a threat and was in fact useful. She was good at this, better than she had expected actually. She had thought of herself as someone competent in contained, formal situations. She was discovering she was equally competent in the opposite, in rough, outdoor, unpredictable situations where what you knew mattered, and what you were called mattered less. She stopped using the name Vane after a few months, because it raised complications in some of the outer territories where her father's history was known and not fondly remembered. She did not use another name. She was simply Seraphine, or she was the woman from Lily's station, or she was the healer with the border maps. She became, gradually, someone who existed without the scaffolding of a name's history supporting her, which felt this too surprised her, not like loss, but like the first honest introduction she had ever made. She wrote in the journal throughout that first year. She wrote about the patients and what she learned from them. She wrote about Lily. She wrote about her mother, returning to the subject again and again from different angles, as if she were circling something she was trying to see clearly. She wrote about what it meant to have a skill that was genuinely useful, not decorative, not political, not useful in the sense of moving pieces on a board, but useful in the way that a warm hand on a feverish forehead is useful. It meets you exactly where you are. She wrote near the end of the first year in a very small entry that she almost didn't write at all. I think I understand now what my mother understood. Not what she knew, not what she did, I'm still learning those. But why she went, I think she needed this, to be exactly the right size for the place she was in. She read this back and decided it was true, and closed the journal. The second year was easier, which was its own kind of difficulty. When things become easier, you have the space to feel what you haven't been feeling, and she had accumulated a great deal she hadn't been feeling. She dealt with it the way she dealt with everything, honestly, systematically, without drama, and mostly at night in the margins of the journal. She felt, working through it carefully, genuine grief about her father, not simple grief, because he had been a complicated man who had made choices that had consequences, but grief nonetheless, for the version of him she had needed as a child and had only sometimes had access to. She felt something for her mother that she couldn't name, something between gratitude and longing, and the specific sorrow of understanding someone more fully than you could when they were alive to ask questions of. She felt, when she allowed herself to be honest about it, that what she had experienced in the palace was less like a failed marriage and more like a sustained erasure, the slow, methodical deletion of her dimensions until she fit into the space that had been allotted for her. She understood now that she had let it happen, had moved within the constraints with enough graceful efficiency that she had mistaken management for survival, and that the 3 months had not been wasted, but they had not been what she was capable of, either. She was more than what those 3 months had been. She had suspected it, she knew it now. Midway through the second year, she negotiated her first treaty. It was a small thing in the scale of political events, but a large thing in the scale of a single day. 2 outer packs, Coldmore and Ashfin, had been in a dispute over a shared water source that had been worsening for 2 seasons. The dispute had begun to interfere with the trade routes that both packs used, which was affecting the field station's supply lines, which was Lily's problem and therefore Seraphine's problem. She asked Lily's permission to try something, and Lily looked at her with the particular expression she had developed for Seraphine's proposals, which combined complete confidence and genuine curiosity about how it would unfold, and said, "Try it." Seraphine went to the Coldmore elder first because she had been working in Coldmore territory for a year and he knew her face. She did not arrive with a proposal. She arrived with a question: "Tell me in as much detail as you can what the original arrangement was before the dispute began." He talked, she listened, she took notes, she asked clarifying questions, she thanked him and left. She went to the Ashfin elder the next day. Same question, he talked, she listened, she took notes. She went home to the station and spread her notes on the table and looked at them for a long time and found what she was looking for. A specific misunderstanding that had occurred 4 seasons ago about the meaning of a word in the original water rights agreement, a word that had a different meaning in Coldmore usage than in Ashfin usage, and which had generated 2 seasons of escalating conflict that was, at its root, a simple and correctable error of translation. She wrote a document. She had it reviewed by Lily, who was from neither pack and could read it fresh. She brought the document to both elders separately and walked each of them through it, and watched the moment, in each room, separately, when a man who had been angry for 2 seasons understood that he had been angry about a misunderstanding. The elders met 3 days later, the agreement was signed, the water source was shared again, the trade routes reopened. Neither elder mentioned that she had been a Luna queen in a life that felt like someone else's. They called her Seraphine, or they called her the healer from Lily's station. She preferred these. She came home that evening and sat by the station fire and let herself feel the fullness of what had happened, which was not about the treaty specifically, but about the discovery that she could do this, that the competence she had developed in the formal, constrained, political environment of the palace was transferable, was in fact more powerful outside of it, where she was the one choosing when and how and whether to use it. She felt, sitting by that fire, something she would later describe in the journal simply as, "I am exactly the right size for this." In the 3rd year, a young wolf from one of the southern packs, came through the station on his way somewhere else, and spent 3 days recovering from a leg injury. On the second day he asked her name, and when she told him, he said slowly, with the particular expression of someone running a name against a memory, "Seraphine, there's a woman they call the Unbound Luna in the Outer Territories, someone who's been working the border camps and the pack disputes. Different name, I think, but are you from the palace?" She looked at him. She said carefully, "I'm from here, this station, why do you ask?" He shrugged. "People have been talking, the Cold Morashvan agreement, and the thing with the Grayfen pack and the medicine shortage. Someone fixed that too fast, someone who knew the supply routes better than the council ever has. People are noticing, the outer packs I mean. They're noticing that someone is moving through, who knows what she's doing." She said nothing for a moment, then she said, "Tell me about the Grayfen medicine shortage." He told her. She listened. She filed it. That evening she said to Lily, "Have you heard anything about a medicine shortage in the Grayfen territory?" Lily looked up from her records. "Third-hand report 2 weeks ago, 2 camps affected, trade route disruption I think." She paused. "Were you thinking of going?" "I was thinking of finding out more first." Lily nodded. "There's a Grayfen representative at the market in Aldwick, 4 days east. She could be there next week." "Then I'll go to Aldwick next week," Seraphine said. She did. She found the representative. She spent 2 days learning the specifics of the shortage. She came back and spent a week solving it, not alone, but as the connecting point between 3 parties who each had part of the solution and didn't know about each other. When it was fixed, she moved on. She did not stay to take credit. She went back to the station and told Lily what had happened, and Lily made them both tea, and they sat at the table and talked about the medical supply network for the outer territories as it currently existed, and how it could be better, and Seraphine took notes. The 4th year brought the young pack girl. Her name was Nell. She was 15 and from a small inner territory pack who had come to the outer camps with her father for what was supposed to be a seasonal labor arrangement, and had stayed when her father went back, because she had decided, with the absolute certainty of a 15-year-old who has found her purpose, that she was going to be a healer. She attached herself to the station and to Seraphine specifically, following her on rounds, asking approximately 900 questions per day, helping with tasks she hadn't been asked to help with and doing them correctly. Seraphine taught her. This was new. She had learned alongside Lily, which was different from teaching. Teaching required her to understand things at a different level, to break apart what she knew and reassemble it in a way that could be transferred. It was, she found, one of the most interesting things she had done. Nell was quick and precise and unfrightened of the harder parts of the work, and watching her learn was like watching someone grow into a shape that had been waiting for her. One afternoon, near the end of Nell's first season at the station, Nell said, without particular preamble, while they were reorganizing the supply shelves, "You were someone important before, weren't you?" Seraphine looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "The way you talk to elders," Nell said. She was matter-of-fact about it, the way only 15-year-olds can be matter-of-fact about things that are actually quite perceptive. Like you're used to being the smartest person in the room, and you've decided to be kind about it. Seraphine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was someone the palace needed me to be. I'm something different now." Nell considered this with the gravity she applied to most things. "Better or worse?" she asked. Seraphine thought about it honestly. "Both," she said, "in different directions." Nell nodded as if this made complete sense, which, Seraphine thought, it probably did. She had learned over 4 years that the young people in the outer territories were not naive in the ways that wealth and protection could make a person naive. They understood that things could be more than one thing at once. The 5th year was the year she stopped being surprised by her own capability. This was more significant than it sounded. For most of her life before the palace, during the palace, and in the early years of the station, she had operated with a constant mild uncertainty about whether she would be equal to what was being asked of her. Not paralyzing uncertainty, not the kind that stopped you moving, just the low-frequency background awareness that success was not guaranteed and required active maintenance. She had treated it as reasonable and useful, this uncertainty. It kept her sharp. In the 5th year it faded. Not arrogance, she was too familiar with the things she didn't know for arrogance. But a ground-level confidence that had become structural. She knew what she was doing, she knew why she was doing it, she knew how to figure out what she didn't know. The uncertainty had served its purpose and was no longer required. She noticed this first on a winter morning when she walked into a camp dispute between two pack members that had turned physically dangerous, and she walked between them without hesitation and put her hands up and spoke in the clear, quiet voice she had developed, not commanding, not pleading, just absolutely certain, and they both stopped, because she had not been afraid when she did it. She thought about it afterward, the absence of fear. Not because the situation hadn't been dangerous, but because she had been, in that moment, more solid than the danger. She wrote in the journal that night, "I understand now what Lily is, what my mother was. It's not about being fearless. It's about being so completely present in what you're doing that fear doesn't have the space to get in." In the 6th year, a letter arrived with the palace seal on it. She had seen 3 of them by this point, delivered through various channels that suggested the palace was aware, in a general way, that she was in the outer territories. The previous 2 she had left unopened, not because she was afraid of the contents, but because she had decided simply and clearly that she was not ready to re-enter correspondence with that world. She had set boundaries around herself as carefully as she set them around a wound, and the palace was something she would engage with when she chose to, and not before. This one she held for longer. She sat with it in the east wing of the station. She had taken over an east-facing storage room as her own space, and she was aware she had done this and was privately amused by it, and she turned it over in her hands and felt the weight of it. She put it in the fire. She watched it burn. She thought about nothing in particular while it burned, and then she went back to the main room where Nell and Lily and 2 newer station members were eating supper, and she sat down and accepted a bowl and contributed to the conversation about the upcoming Grayfen supply run, and the evening passed as evenings had been passing for 6 years, with purpose and warmth and the particular satisfaction of days that have been fully used. The 7th year came like all years in the outer territories came practically, with its complications already built in. She was 30 now. This meant something different than 29 had meant, not in the way people said it meant, as if something was ending, but in the way that round numbers provide an accurate measurement of how far a person has walked. She thought in the early weeks of her 30th year about what she had built, not what she had survived. Survival was the minimum, and she had long since exceeded it. What she had built. The station had grown under Lily's and her combined work to serve 12 camps and 3 regular pack territories. Nell had become a healer who could handle anything Seraphine could handle and several things she was still better at, and had trained 2 others. The treaty between Coldmore and Ashfin had held for 5 years, and had been referenced in 2 other border disputes as a model for resolution. The Unbound Luna was what they called her in the outer territories. She had not chosen the name and she did not use it herself. She understood what it was, a way of naming something that didn't fit into the categories the existing system provided for, not a pack Luna, not an Alpha's bound partner, something that had found its own form in the absence of a provided one. She was sitting in her east-facing room on a morning in the 7th year, reading a report from a Grayfen pack contact about water contamination affecting 2 camps, when Lily knocked and entered and said without preamble, because Lily had never used preamble, "There's a man from the palace, stayed at the Wayfarers Inn in Aldwick last night. He's asking about you not by your station name, by your palace name. He's careful about it. He's not threatening, but he's thorough." Seraphine set the report down. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "What does he look like?" Lily described him, middle-aged, official-bearing, wearing clothes that were not quite court formal, but were clearly not from the outer territories either. Not Selim, a representative. She had known this moment would arrive eventually. She had not flinched from knowing it. She sat now and considered what it meant and what she was going to do about it, with the same clarity she had brought to every decision since the morning she walked out a palace door in her mother's boots. The outer packs needed her. That was the first consideration, and it was the one that settled everything else. 3 of the territories she worked with were directly involved in the crisis that was. She had been hearing about this for weeks, through her network of pack contacts and camp leaders, threatening to fracture the Drac realm's outer borders. She had relationships those borders could not replace. She had knowledge the court did not have. She was not going back for Selim Drac. She was not going back for a crown. She was going back because the people she had built 7 years of actual relationship with were caught in a political situation that someone with her skills and her specific connections could help navigate. That was the decision. She said to Lily, "Tell him I'll speak with him tomorrow morning, here, not at the inn." Lily nodded. She turned to go and then stopped and turned back and said, "You don't have to go." I know, Seraphine said. But you're going. Yes. Lily looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has watched a person become what they were always going to become, and finds it exactly as inevitable as it felt when it was just beginning. All right, she said. I'll put tea on for the morning. Seraphine looked back at the water contamination report. She picked up her pen. She had notes to finish. There was still work to do tonight, which was the same as every other night, which was the only way she knew how to live now, and she would not trade it for anything the palace had or ever could have offered. She wrote until the lamp grew low, and then she went to sleep, and in the morning she would speak to the palace representative, and after that she would decide step by step what happened next. She was not afraid of what happened next. She hadn't been afraid for a very long time. The representative's name was Aldrich. He was polite, efficient, and clearly experienced in situations where the person he had been sent to speak to was under no particular obligation to cooperate. He did not begin with authority. He began with facts which she respected. He told her that 3 outer territories had, within the past 6 weeks, formally withdrawn their compliance from the existing trade and protection agreements with the Drac realm. He named them Grafin, Coldmoor, and the Ashfin Corridor. He told her that the palace's current diplomatic approach was not working, and that the council had been advised, through multiple channels, that there was one person in the outer territories who had existing relationships with all 3 of the dissenting pacts, and who was trusted by their leadership in a way that no palace representative was. She listened. She asked 3 questions, each of which made him blink slightly, because they were precise, and they indicated that she already knew more about the situation than he had expected. She said, "What authority would I have in any negotiation?" He said, "The council is prepared to offer full diplomatic standing as the king's personal representative." She said, "The king's personal representative is not a category I'm interested in. My authority would need to be independent of the king's name, or it means nothing in those territories." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I can take that back to the council." "Do that," she said, "and tell them I'll consider it, but I'm not going to the palace first. If I'm going to negotiate on behalf of anyone's interests, I'm going to the camps first to understand what they actually need." He looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. He said, "I'll communicate that." He left. She went back to work. Over the next 2 weeks, she did exactly what she had said she would do. She went to Grafin first, because the water contamination situation was both urgent and a useful entry point. She arrived with solutions, not requests, and the Grafin elder, a woman named Bram whose handshake was like grabbing hold of a tree root, regarded her with the particular respect that practical people have for other practical people. She asked what had happened. She listened. The full account took a long time, and she let it take the time it took, which mattered. She had learned over 7 years that the length of time you were willing to listen was itself a form of respect that could not be faked. The withdrawal from the palace agreements was not random. It was a response to a specific pattern: 3 consecutive seasons in which the court's trade committee had promised resources and failed to deliver, compounding existing issues that had been raised and ignored for longer than 3 seasons. The outer territories had not left the agreements in anger. They had left them because the agreements had stopped functioning as agreements and had become a list of things the palace said it would do, and the outer territories had found other ways to meet their needs. She went to Coldmoor, she went to Ashfin, she heard the same story in different voices. She did not promise them anything from the palace. She asked them what they needed, specifically, practically, in terms of what would need to be different for an agreement to function. She wrote everything down. By the time she had completed all 3 visits, she had a document. It was not a draft treaty. It was a record, what the outer territories required in their own words in the specific terms they had used. She had not interpreted or softened or adjusted it for palatability. It said what they said. She traveled back toward the palace. She had not been back in 7 years. The road was familiar the way a memory is familiar, correctly shaped but slightly smaller than you remember, as if the distance between you and a thing reveals that what you were measuring was mostly feeling. She stopped at the Wayfarers Inn where she had slept on her first night of traveling, 7 years ago. The innkeeper's wife was gone. A daughter ran it now, who had the same practical efficiency without the recognition. She ate soup and slept. In the morning she packed up and continued. She did not think about what it would feel like to approach the palace gates, or rather she thought about it practically, which was different. She thought, the gates will be guarded. She thought, there will be a formal entry process. She thought, I will not wait in a reception room because I did not come on anyone's schedule but my own, and that is the first thing that has to be clear. She arrived at the palace border at midday. She had ridden the last 2 days. Bram from Grafen had offered her a horse which she had accepted, and she came through the outer checkpoint without announcing herself in advance. The checkpoint guard knew who she was. She could tell from the way he straightened and then recalibrated, the double take of a man encountering something he had been told about but had not expected to encounter in person, on an ordinary afternoon on the road. She said, I'm here to speak with the council. You can send word ahead. I'll wait here but not long. He sent word. They sent a formal escort, which she permitted, and an offer of the guest quarters, which she declined. She said she would stay at the inn in the outer village, which was technically within the palace territory but not inside the palace walls, and which suited her purposes. The escort looked uncertain. She was not uncertain, which was the relevant quality. The palace outer grounds had been somewhat changed. A new building in the eastern quarter, different plantings near the courtyard she had once looked at from the east wing windows. She noted these the way she noted everything, without sentiment, with attention. The bond registered more clearly here. Stronger than it had been in the outer territories, because the distance was shorter and something about the place itself, the concentration of his presence in it, the years of his governance embedded in its stone, made the thread more present. She was aware of it as a sound growing more distinct as you walked toward its source. She did not follow the thread. She went to the inn, she unpacked, she reviewed her document. The council meeting was arranged for the following morning. She arrived before the scheduled time, which was a choice rather than a habit. She had time to settle in the anteroom, to be already present when they filed in, rather than arriving to a room that had already formed itself around an assumption about who held the authority in it. 9 council members. Elder Prentice among them, older now, with more white in the beard but the same sharp calibration behind the eyes. He looked at her the way he had looked at her at the wedding dinner, 7 years ago, assessing, condescending, already deciding what she was worth. She looked at him directly, clearly, and waited for him to look away first. He did. She placed her document on the table. She said, this is what the 3 territories need. It is specific, it is accurate, and it reflects what their leadership told me in their own words. I have not interpreted or adjusted it. If the council wants my assessment of how to meet these requirements in practical terms, I'm prepared to offer that. But we should begin here. One of the younger council members, a woman Seraphine did not recognize, perhaps 30, with the careful attentiveness of someone who had learned to listen before speaking, reached for the document and began reading. The others followed. Elder Prentice let a junior member hand it to him rather than reaching himself. She watched them read. She waited with the patience of someone who has spent 7 years in situations where waiting was part of the work. Selim came in while they were reading. She had known he would. She had positioned herself with her back partially to the door so that his entrance would require her to turn deliberately, which meant it would be her choice when she turned rather than a reflex. She heard the door. She heard the change in the room, the slight recalibration of postures, the shift of attention. She counted 3 seconds. She turned. He was standing at the head of the table. He was 7 years older. He looked. She took this in without allowing it to do anything unnecessary. The same. The authority was the same. The contained quality was the same. The face that was built for command and had never softened. He was looking at her. She had thought about this moment in a variety of ways over 7 years. Mostly she had not thought about it directly, because direct thought about it required her to have feelings about it that she had decided were not her most productive use of energy. But occasionally, in honest moments in the east-facing room with the lamp low, she had let herself wonder what it would feel like. It felt, she discovered, like identifying a landmark after a long journey, accurate, informative, present. She said, "Your Majesty." The 2 words were clean, clear, exact. They established precisely the distance she intended, and she saw in the very slight shift of something in his face that he understood what they established. The room was absolutely quiet. He said after a moment, "Seraphine." Her name in his voice, still careful, still like reading a word aloud for the first time. but something else in it now, something that had not been there in the palace 7 years ago, something she clocked but did not examine. She turned back to the table. "The document," she said to the council, "should be your starting point. Where would you like to begin?" The meeting ran for 3 hours. She was precise, thorough, and uncompromising on the things that required it and pragmatic on the things that permitted compromise. She knew these territories. She knew their leadership. She knew the specific points where the palace had repeatedly failed and why. She said all of this without softening it, because softening it would have been a disservice to everyone in the room, including the king who had sat at the head of the table for 3 hours and said less than anyone else and listened to everything. When the meeting ended, the council members gathered their papers. The young councilwoman, she introduced herself as Nora, stopped beside Seraphine and said quietly, "That document is the most useful thing this table has seen in 2 years. Thank you." Seraphine said, "Thank Grayfen and Coldmore and Ashfin. They're the ones who knew what they needed. I just wrote it down." Nora looked at her with an expression that said she understood this was not false modesty, but an actual structural point about where credit should land. She nodded and left. Seraphine began gathering her own papers. She did not look toward the head of the table. She did not need to look. The palace was the same in its bones and different in its skin, and she walked the corridors of the outer diplomatic wing with the practiced ease of someone who knows a place in memory and has confirmed that memory is accurate. She did not go to the West Wing. She did not go to the East Wing. She stayed in the outer diplomatic sector, which was neutral ground, which was exactly what she had chosen. The council offered her the title of High Representative, which was functional if not satisfying. She said she would think about the title. What she wanted first was a working structure, specific authority in the 3-territory negotiation, a direct line to the council's trade committee that did not pass through Elder Prentice, and the ability to communicate directly with the Grayfen, Coldmore, and Ashfin leadership without palace protocol officers as intermediaries. She put these 3 things in writing and delivered them to the council secretary before the 2nd day began. Elder Prentice moved against her on the 3rd day. It was not direct. It was not meant to be seen as personal, which was how she knew it was personal. He called a procedural session, a formal council review of the authority granted to any individual who was not a sitting council member and who had been granted temporary diplomatic standing, and he conducted it with the careful, elaborate neutrality of someone who has decided the outcome in advance and is constructing the process around it. She knew about the session before it happened because Nora sent her a brief, indirect note that said only, "There is a procedural session tomorrow morning at 8. You are not required to attend, but it would be better if you did." She attended. She arrived before Elder Prentice. She sat in the chair that required him to address the center of the room rather than look directly at her or avoid looking at her. She put her hands flat on the table and sat with the stillness she had spent 7 years developing, which was the stillness of someone who is not waiting to see what will happen, but has already thought through several versions of what might happen and prepared for each. Prentice presented his argument with the practiced smoothness of decades of council politics. The core of it was simple. Seraphine held no legitimate standing. She was legally still the Luna Queen. The bond had not been formally dissolved, no dissolution had been filed, but she had abandoned her position without council approval. Granting her diplomatic authority retroactively validated an unauthorized departure. This created a precedent the council should not allow. He was technically correct about the standing. She had known he would be technically correct. That was where he was most dangerous, not in his contempt, which was visible and manageable, but in his precision. She waited until he finished. She said, "The council is correct that the legal standing is unresolved. I'd like to address that directly." She reached into her document case and produced a second document, which she had prepared the previous evening. She passed copies to each council member. "This is a formal request for a review of the bond's legal standing to be conducted by the court recorder under the standard dissolution procedure. I'm requesting this myself because I agree that an unresolved status is not useful for anyone." She watched Elder Prentice read the document. She watched something shift in his expression, the particular recalibration of a man who has prepared for a fight and found the other party has moved the ground. "In the meantime," she said, "the authority I've been granted is operational, not based on personal standing. It was granted by the council for a specific purpose. The purpose is still active. Grayfen, Coldmore, and Ashfin are still in withdrawal from their agreements. The negotiation needs to continue. Nora spoke then. She spoke clearly and without the tentative quality of someone who was uncertain whether she was permitted to. She said, "The practical question before this council is whether withdrawing Representative Seraphine's authority now, with the negotiation in progress, serves the realm's interest." "I would argue it does not." 3 other council members agreed, not all of them. 4 of the 9 remained visibly aligned with Prentice's position. But 4 against 4 left 1 vote, and that vote was Selim's, and he had not spoken. Everyone in the room understood this. She looked at the head of the table. He had been listening for the entire session with the focused, undemonstrative attention she had observed in council sessions 7 years ago. He looked at the document she had produced. He looked at Prentice. He looked at the table as a whole. He said, without particular weight, as if it were simply the next item on a list, "Representative Seraphine's authority in the 3-territory negotiation stands. Elder Prentice, the procedural concern is noted and will be addressed through the review process she has requested. Are there other items before the council?" The session closed. Seraphine gathered her papers. She was precise about it, unhurried. She was aware that Prentice's eyes were on her and that there was something in the room that was not resolved, that his opposition was structural and would not end because of a single lost procedural motion. Nora fell into step beside her in the corridor after the session. She said quietly, "He'll try again." "I know," Seraphine said. "He's afraid of you, not of your title or your history, of what you represent specifically. Your evidence that the outer territories can function without the court's management, and he has spent 30 years arguing that they cannot." Seraphine looked at her. "How long have you been on the council?" 3 years, Nora said. "I was 19 when you left, I remember it." Seraphine was quiet for a moment. "What do you remember?" Nora thought about it. "I remember that no one said much officially, and I remember my mother, who was a council member then, she retired 2 years ago, coming home from a session in the first week after, and she was very quiet. And I asked her what had happened, and she said, 'A woman made a sensible choice and we are all going to pretend she didn't.'" Seraphine absorbed this. She said, "Your mother sounds like someone worth knowing." "She is," Nora said. "I'll introduce you." They reached the corridor junction where they went different directions. Nora turned toward her council office. Seraphine turned toward the outer wing. She stopped walking after a few steps. She had not, in the 3 days she had been here, gone to the east wing. She had not sought out the hidden library. She had not wanted to, or had not been certain that she wanted to, or had been operating with such disciplined forward momentum that she had not left herself the space to want it. She stood in the corridor and held the question. Then she walked to the east wing. The passage was the same. The same stone, the same quality of quiet that was different from the rest of the palace, slightly more abandoned, slightly less maintained. The door at the end of the corridor, the same. She put her hand on the latch. It was still unlocked. She pushed the door open. The room was exactly as she had left it. The dust on the surfaces, the maps on the wall, the cracked leather chair. The table where she had sat for 3 months and written in her journal and looked at maps and thought about exits and thought about her mother and thought, in the small hours of many nights, about what she was going to do next. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she stepped inside and closed the door. She went to the map on the wall. She stood in front of it and looked at it the way she had always looked at it, following the lines of the outer territories, finding the places she had been, the camps and the villages and the roads that she now knew in her feet as well as her eyes. Coldmore, Ashfin, Grayfen, the field station not marked, but she knew where it sat in the geography. Her mother's roads. Her roads now. She stood there for a long time, not in grief, not in triumph, something quieter and more permanent than either, a kind of recognition. She had been this person for a long time. She had been becoming her in this room, in this palace, in the 7 years between. She was not different here than she was in the outer territories. That was, she thought, the thing she had needed to confirm. She was the same person in both places. She took one slow breath, she turned. She left the room, pulling the door softly behind her. She walked back to the outer wing. She had work to do. The negotiation with the 3 territories was at its most delicate point, and tomorrow's session would require her full attention. She had notes to review and a proposal to refine, and a set of practical commitments she needed the council to confirm in writing before she could take them back to the outer packs. She went back to her papers. She worked until late. In the small hours, she wrote briefly in the journal. She wrote, "I found the room, it held what I left in it, so did I." She capped the pen. She slept. He came to her in the outer diplomatic wing on the fourth evening. She had just finished reviewing the final version of the three-territory proposal, 14 hours of negotiation across 2 days, 2 council sessions, and 1 very long private conversation with Nora in which they had worked out the specific language on 3 points that the outer packs required, and the council found uncomfortable, and she was sitting at the small desk in her temporary working space with her coat still on, and her boots not yet removed, reading the document for the last time before she was satisfied with it. He knocked. This was the first time, in all the days she had been here, that he had sought her out in a space that was hers rather than encountering her in shared territory. She noted this because she noted everything, and because it was actually a significant departure from what she had known of him. She said, "Come in." He entered, he closed the door. He looked at the desk and the papers and the lamp and her coat still on, and he said, "You're still working." "I'm finishing," she said. "Sit down if you like." He sat in the chair across the desk. She set the document down and looked at him. He looked at her. Outside the diplomatic wing's window, the palace grounds were dark, the perimeter lamps burning their usual fixed light. He said, "The proposal is good, better than anything the council has produced in 2 years." She said, "It should be. The outer territories told me what they needed and I listened." He was quiet for a moment. Not the contained, impersonal quiet she remembered from the council sessions 7 years ago, something with more texture. He said, "I want to offer you the High Luna title, formally, with full authority." He reached into his coat and produced a document that she could see from where she sat was already drawn up, the council seal, the specific language of the position. "The title was created after you left. It has never been held. The proposal was always that if there was ever a person suited to it." She said, "Stop." He stopped. She said, "I can see what you've written. I'm not questioning your sincerity. I'm going to tell you why the frame is wrong, and I need you to listen without responding until I'm finished." He was quiet. She said, "The position you're offering is still contingent on your house, on your crown, on your authority granting mine. If I accept on those terms, every action I take in the outer territories is filtered through the question of whether the king supports it, and the outer packs will know that, and it will change what I can do. The work I've done for 7 years is based on something different. It's based on relationships I built, authority I earned from the people I served. That can't be granted. It already exists. What I need is a formal structure that recognizes what already exists." She stopped. He said after a moment, "What does that look like?" She had prepared for this too. She reached into the document case and produced her own draft, 3 pages, specific, written with the same care she brought to everything. She slid it across the desk. He read it. He read it completely, which took time, and she sat and let it take the time it took. Outside, an owl made a sound once, and then the grounds were quiet again. He set the document down. He looked at her. He said, "The 3rd clause. The council will argue that independent authority outside the crown's line creates a precedent they can't manage." "I know," she said. "They argued the same thing about the Cold Morashvan agreement when it didn't go through palace channels. The agreement has held for 5 years. "Yes," he said. Another quiet. She did not fill it. He said, "Seraphine," he stopped. He picked up her document and set it down again. He said, "When you left." She said, "We don't need to go through the night you left, I mean the night I left. Not tonight. Tonight we're solving the governance question. If you want to have the other conversation, it has its own requirements, and this isn't the time or the conditions." He looked at her. He said slowly, "What are its requirements?" She said, "More honesty than either of us has practiced in this building, which is significant." She picked up her pen. "Can we finish the document?" He said after a moment, "Yes." They worked for 2 hours. He knew the council's concerns with precision, and she knew the outer territories' requirements with the same precision, and between the two of them they found, line by line and clause by clause, the language that would hold. She had not expected him to be useful in this way. She had expected him to be the obstacle she negotiated around rather than the person she negotiated with. She found, working beside him in the lamplight, that she had to update several assumptions she had been carrying since the palace and since the 7 years between. He was more self-aware than she had believed. He knew what he had failed at. He said so once, briefly, without drama, while they were working through the second clause. The Trade Committee's failures in the outer territories, I was aware of the pattern earlier than I acted on it. That's not the Council's failure. That's mine. She did not tell him it was fine. She said, "Yes, I know it's in the document." He took this without flinching, which was the thing that required her to update the most. At midnight the document was done. She read it through once more. She signed the bottom. She slid it to him. He read it once more. The second time was faster, confirming, not discovering, and he signed it beside her name. She looked at their names on the document. She thought about the last document she had signed beside him, 7 years ago, in the obsidian hall with the torches that didn't flicker, and the 300 wolves in perfect silence. This felt different, not because it was warmer, the lamp was low and the room was cold and they were both still in their working clothes. Different because this time, both of them had actually read what they were signing. She stood, she put the signed document in the document case. She said, "I'll take this to Grayfen first, 2 days, then Coldmore and Ashfin. I'll bring the signed accords back here." He stood also. He said, "I'll come with you." She looked at him. He said, "Not as a king visiting his territories, as someone who needs to understand what you know. You said the Council's failing was that they hadn't been to the outer territories. I haven't been either." She held his gaze for a moment. She said, "You'd need to come as an observer, not as the authority. I can't take someone into those camps who is going to override what I've built." He said, "I understand." She thought about this. She thought about Bram, who would recognize him immediately and whose reaction she could not predict. She thought about Nell, who would look at him with the direct, precise eyes of a healer and form opinions she would keep to herself unless directly asked, at which point she would share them completely. She thought about Lily, who had said, "You don't have to go," and meant it, and whose judgment she trusted more than almost anyone's. She said, "I'll tell you on the road." He nodded. She picked up her document case. She walked to the door. She opened it. She stopped in the doorway. She said without turning, "The signing tomorrow, the formal one with the Council. Nora should present it. Not Elder Prentice, not you, not me. Nora, she's the one who protected its existence in the procedural session. She should be seen to own it." She heard him consider this. He said, "I agree." She walked out. She went back to her inn in the outer village. She put the document case under the bed. She sat on the edge of the bed and held still for a moment, taking stock of what had just happened. She had negotiated a structure that gave her real authority in the places that needed it. She had done it on her terms. The conversation that had been waiting 7 years had been named and deferred to a time when she could engage with it on equal ground. She had asked a man who had once been a wall of absence to come and learn something from the world she had built. She did not know what to do with the last part. She held it and did not rush it and decided, as she decided everything, to let it be exactly what it was and see what it became. She lay back on the bed. She looked at the ceiling. Outside, the palace was quiet. Somewhere in its stone and corridors was the East Wing, and the hidden library, and the map on the wall with the faded borders of the outer territories. She closed her eyes. In the morning, there was a road. The road to Grayfen took 2 days, and they did not speak easily at first, which she had expected. She rode and he rode, and the landscape opened up the way it always did past the palace territory, broader, wilder, with the particular quality of light that the outer regions had, as if it came from a slightly larger sky. On the first day he asked her questions. He asked them carefully, with the precision she remembered from council sessions but without the formality. He asked about the field station, about how the supply networks functioned, about the Coldmore-Ashfin resolution, and how she had found the core misunderstanding. She answered straightforwardly. She found, as the first day progressed, that it was easier than she had anticipated. Not because the history between them had softened, it was present, she was aware of it. It was not something that dissolved because 2 people were having a productive conversation. But the history and the present conversation were separate enough that she could engage with one without the other flooding in. She told him about Lily. She told him about Nell. She told him about the water contamination in Grayfen and what the camp populations had been living with while the Court Trade Committee handled the situation through correspondence. He listened. He was a better listener than she had expected, or he had become a better one. She could not know which. That evening they stopped at a wayfarer's shelter, a small, practical structure maintained by the Outer Territory Network, nothing resembling palace accommodation. He looked at the sleeping arrangements, which were two narrow cots separated by a wall that had a gap in it, and he said nothing, which she appreciated. She ate camp food, dried meat, hard bread, a hot drink that tasted roughly like tea if you were being generous, and he ate the same without comment. She found this notable. She had expected adjustment, some evidence of a person encountering an unfamiliar level of discomfort. There was none. She said, near the end of the meal, more to see his response than because she required the answer, "Do you know why the Outer Territories don't trust the Council?" He said, without hesitation, "Because the Council manages the Outer Territories as an administrative category rather than engaging with them as communities with specific histories and relationships." She looked at him. He said, "I've known this for several years. I have not resolved it." She said, "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Because resolving it required understanding what the Outer Territories actually needed, and that understanding required someone with the relationships and knowledge to access it, and the Council's structure doesn't produce that person." She said, "It produced me." He looked at her. He said, "You produced yourself. The Council had nothing to do with it." She picked up her cup. She took a drink. She said, "That's the most accurate thing you've said since the palace." He said quietly, "I know there is more that needs to be said. I'm not going to say it here because you were right that this is not the time or the conditions." She said, "What made you agree with that, by the way?" He said, "Because it was true, and because I'm aware that in the past I was not reliable about recognizing true things in time to act on them." The fire in the shelter's small hearth made a sound. Outside, the night was very quiet. She said, "Go to sleep." He went to sleep. She sat by the fire for a while longer. She was thinking about the bond, which had been doing something over the past few days that she did not have language for. It had changed in quality, still the same thread, but warmer or more present, or perhaps she was simply in closer physical proximity and registering it differently. She held it in her awareness the way you hold a sound you're trying to identify carefully without grabbing at it. She went to sleep. The second day opened into Grayfen territory, and the land changed, becoming hillier and more forested, with the particular smell of the northern reaches, pine and cold water and wood smoke. She felt her shoulders ease. She had not known they were not at ease until they eased. Bram met them at the camp entrance. She looked at Selim for a long, assessing moment, the kind of moment that contained an entire opinion and its evidence and its conclusion, all without a word, and then she looked at Seraphine and said, "You brought him." Seraphine said, "He came to learn. He will listen and not direct." Bram looked at him again. She said to Selim directly, "The last palace representative we had here told us our concerns were noted and being processed. What does that mean to you?" He said, "It means you weren't heard." Bram held his gaze. She said, "Correct." She turned back to Seraphine. "Come in. There's a situation with the water supply you need to see." They went in. The day was full and hard in the practical sense. There were 4 immediate issues at the camp that required attention, and Seraphine moved between them with the ease of someone who has done this specific thing for a long time, and Selim followed and watched, and to his considerable credit, helped where help was asked for and stayed quiet where it was not. He helped carry supply crates with a young pack member who looked at him with barely concealed astonishment, and then looked at Seraphine for confirmation that this was real, and she gave the smallest nod, and the pack member handed him a crate and he carried it. In the late afternoon, Bram took them to see the water source situation firsthand. It was a contamination issue from runoff. She could see it immediately, and she explained it to Bram and the camp's supply manager with the specificity of someone who has handled this category of problem before. She pulled the map book from her bag and pointed at the upstream source. She described the solution. Bram listened. She asked 3 questions. She nodded. She said, "How long?" "If we start tomorrow, 2 weeks, Seraphine said. Bram said, "Then we start tomorrow." She looked at Selim. "Your trade committee sent 2 letters about this situation. Neither of them mentioned that the problem was upstream contamination." He said, "They didn't know." "No," she said, "they didn't." The accord signing took place the next morning. It was brief and practical, which was how Bram did things. She read the document, noted 3 things she wanted confirmed verbally before she signed, received confirmation on all 3 and signed. She handed the pen to Seraphine. Seraphine signed. She held the pen towards Selim. He looked at Bram. He said, "This is Seraphine's accord. My signature is the council's ratification. It can follow through official channels when she returns." Bram looked at him. Something shifted in her assessment slightly, not warmly but accurately. She said, "You've learned something." He said, "I'm learning." Bram looked at Seraphine. She said, "Come back in 2 weeks for the supply run." They left Grayfen on the 3rd morning, Coldmoor next, then Ashfin. The road curved north, and the hills grew greener, and the sky moved over them large and pale and full of running clouds. Somewhere between Grayfen and Coldmoor, riding on the open road with the wind coming from the northwest, and the trees on either side still holding their last leaves, he said, "I was wrong about most of it." She did not ask him to be more specific. She knew what he meant. She said, "Yes. I knew it was wrong in the 3rd month," he said. "Not the specific things, the fundamental thing. I knew the arrangement was not. I knew it had not been designed for what a person actually needed." She said, "And you didn't change it?" "No." She held this for a moment. She thought about what she wanted from this conversation, and she was honest with herself about it, which she was always honest with herself about everything. She did not want his regret. She did not need it. She did not need him to have understood it sooner, because understanding it sooner would have been a different life, and the life she had led, the 7 years, the station, the roads, the people she had helped and been helped by, was not a consolation prize. It was the real thing. She said, "I don't need you to have done it differently." He looked at her. She said, "I am telling you this clearly, so there's no confusion about what I'm offering in return for an apology. I'm not offering forgiveness for a debt. I'm telling you that who I am now is inseparable from what happened. I'm not going to ask you to undo it even in the theoretical sense, because I wouldn't trade it." He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "What I'm asking for is not a return. I understand it's not a return." She said, "What are you asking for then?" He said, "I am asking for the chance to be present, in whatever form that's possible, which I understand is not the same form as before and requires starting from where we actually are." She thought about this. She thought about it seriously, with the same attention she gave to documents and supply routes and water contamination upstream sources. She turned it over. She looked at it from the side that was the 7 years, and from the side that was the 3 months before, and from the side that was the room in the East Wing, and the morning she walked out, and from the side that was the past 5 days on a road through the outer territories, which was the side she found the most useful for seeing clearly. She said, "I don't know yet." He said, "All right." She said, "I mean that literally. I don't know. I'm not withholding it strategically. I genuinely don't know, and I'm not going to tell you something I don't know because the moment requires an answer." He said, "I know." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because that is what you do. You say what you know and nothing else." She looked at him. The road curved ahead of them through the trees. The light through the canopy was gold and thin. She said, "That's the first accurate thing you've said about me." He said, "It is not the first time I've known an accurate thing about you." She rode for a few moments. She said, "No, but it may be the first time you've said one." He was quiet. She thought it might be something like agreement. They rode on. The road to Coldmoor was longer than the road to Grayfen, and the trees gave way to open moorland, wide and windswept, and the particular color of winter approaching, tawny and brown and gray-purple at the horizon. She had ridden this road a dozen times. She knew where it bent and where the footing was soft, and where, just before the camp came into view, you reached a rise that gave you a brief, complete picture of the land spreading north and south simultaneously. She pulled her horse to a stop at the rise. He pulled up beside her. Below, the camp smoke rising from the fire, figures moving between the buildings, familiar and good. On the horizon north, Ashfin territory. To the south, invisible behind distance and hills, Grayfen. Behind them, 2 days back, the palace. She sat on the rise and looked at all of it. She thought, "I know exactly where I am." Not as a figure of speech. She knew her location on the map she had memorized in the East Wing library, on the road she had walked in her mother's boots, in the network she had built through 7 years of showing up and knowing what she was doing. She knew where she was. She turned her horse toward the camp and rode down. The 3 accords were signed within the week. Grayfen had signed first, Coldmore second. The elder there was a quieter, more deliberate personality than Bram, who read the document 3 times, asked 8 questions, and then signed with the care of someone who understands that written agreements have weight. And Ashfin last, at a meeting that was attended by 6 pack representatives and lasted half a day, and involved the kind of detailed practical discussion that Seraphine found genuinely energizing. Selim observed all 3 signings. He had kept his word. He had been present and had not directed. He had answered direct questions when they were put to him, including one from the Ashfin elder, a lean older man named Colt who had an absolute zero tolerance for anything vague, who looked directly at Selim partway through the discussion and asked, "If the council fails to deliver on the supply commitments in this document in the first quarter, specifically if there is another gap in the medicine trade route, what is the recourse?" Selim said, "Representative Seraphine has the authority under the accord to invoke direct council review, bypassing the trade committee. That review requires a response within 14 days. Colt said, "And if the review produces nothing?" Selim said, "The territories would be within their rights to withdraw again, and I would consider that the council's failure, not the territories." Colt looked at him for a moment. He said, "That's not how this has worked historically." Selim said, "No." Colt looked at Seraphine. He said, "You trust this?" She said, "The structure is in the document. The structure doesn't require trust, it requires accountability, which is different." Colt looked at the document. He picked up the pen. He signed. The 3 accords went into her document case. She carried them back to the palace over 3 days, and on the afternoon of the 3rd day she walked into the council chamber and placed them on the table, and the room was full because Nora had arranged for the full council to be present, and she did not allow herself to be otherwise satisfied. Nora presented the accords to the council. This had been agreed in advance, and Nora did it with the precise, unshowy competence that Seraphine had come to expect from her. She walked the council through each document, the specific commitments, the authority structure, the recourse provisions. She did not editorialize. She let the documents be what they were. Elder Prentice sat through the presentation without speaking. She watched him while Nora spoke. He was doing the arithmetic. She could see it, calculating the changed landscape, the shifted weight of things, the fact that 3 territories that had been in withdrawal were now formally re-engaged through an authority structure that did not depend on him or people like him. He had not lost. Nothing had been taken from him in any direct sense, but the room was different than it had been before she arrived, and he was smart enough to know it. He said when Nora finished, "The council should be cautious about precedents." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Nora said the council should also be cautious about losing 3 territories permanently. These accords prevent that. The precedent question is worth discussing, not today. The council voted on formal ratification. 7-2, Prentice and 1 ally against. Seraphine sat with her hands on her document case and felt the vote land and did not let it show on her face, because there was no need to let it show. The room was already adjusting around the fact of what had just happened, and she did not need to perform her response to it. It was sufficient for it to simply be real. After the session, she sat with Nora and 2 of the younger council members in a small anteroom and worked through the immediate implementation steps. They were practical, specific, and would take 3 months to complete properly. She was going to be in and out of the palace during those 3 months, not residing here, returning to the station between sessions, keeping her roots where they had always been. She did not tell them this. She told them the implementation schedule, and they wrote it down, and when the meeting ended she went back to the outer village inn and sat on the bed and thought. She had been thinking about what Selim had said on the road, the chance to be present, in whatever form that's possible, starting from where we actually are. She had told him she didn't know, and that was still true, but the not knowing had changed texture slightly over the week of travel. It was less a refusal and more an open question. She was not the woman who had left this palace. She was also not a woman who had spent 7 years becoming someone in order to return to a situation that was exactly as it had been. Those were both wrong. She was herself, which was a more complete and capable and weathered version of the person who had walked out of a side door at 4 in the morning 7 years ago, and what she could or couldn't offer from that place was not something she could determine from a general principle. She would have to find out. She was not afraid of finding out. She had not been afraid of much, genuinely afraid since the second year at the station, when she had reached into a badly infected wound at 3 in the morning with no one else present and done what needed to be done, and it had worked. And she had sat afterward in the cold firelight with her hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline and thought, "I can do this," and known that she meant something larger than the wound. She meant all of it. She meant the whole scope of whatever was going to be asked of her. She still meant that. In the morning there was a formal breakfast arranged by the palace, not a court event, something smaller, 6 people including Nora and 2 of the outer territory representatives who had come to the city for the signing. She attended. She ate and talked and was present in the way she was always present, which was completely. Selim was there. They sat not across from each other but at a slight angle 2 places apart, which meant they were in each other's peripheral vision for the duration of the meal. She was aware of this in the exact way she was aware of the bond, continuously, without urgency, as a fact about the landscape. After breakfast, as the others were gathering their things to leave, he said to her quietly, "When you're back for the implementation sessions, if you want to, there are things I'd like to say, when you think the conditions are right." She considered him. She thought about what she had said on the road, more honesty than either of us has practiced in this building. She thought that was still true and still a significant requirement, and that she was capable of meeting it when the time came. She said, "I'll tell you when." He nodded. She left the breakfast and went back to the inn to pack. She was riding back to the station today. She would be back in 6 weeks for the first implementation review. Between now and then there was the water contamination fix in Grayfen to oversee, a supply run to Coldmore, and 3 weeks of ordinary station work. The patients, the rounds, the supply records, the daily particular useful reality of the life she had built. Nell had been managing the station alone this past week and a half and had sent one very brief note that said, "Everything is fine. Colt from Ashford sent a message about something, sorted it, tell you when you're back." She had written back, "Good work." She thought about arriving back, the station fire, Lily's practical warmth, Nell's 900 questions probably backed up, the east-facing room with the low lamp and the journal and the sense of exactly fitting the space she occupied. She carried her bag to the stable and saddled the horse, and rode out through the palace outer gate in the early morning light. She did not look back at the palace gates this time either, but this time it was different, not because she was leaving something behind, but because she was equally here and there, inside this territory and moving through the outer one, the palace in her peripheral vision and the outer roads ahead. Both real, both hers. The road opened. She rode. The formal installation ceremony was held in Coldmore territory, because that had been her condition, and no one had seriously argued otherwise. She had sent 3 proposed terms to the council for the ceremony logistics, and the council had agreed to all 3 within a day, which was the fastest agreement she had received from them on anything, and which told her something about how the weight in the room had redistributed itself. The first term, the ceremony would be held in the outer territories, not in the palace. The second term, the officiating would be performed by the collective outer territory representatives, not by the palace elder or the council. The third term, the title being confirmed High Luna of the outer territories, would exist independent of any crown appointment. It would be confirmed by the territories she served and held in relationship to them. The palace would ratify it as recognition, not as source. Elder Prentice had objected in writing to the third term. The written objection was thorough and technically grounded, which was his strongest mode. She read it carefully, identified the 3 strongest points, and wrote a response that addressed all 3 and held the position. The council had voted. The term stood. She rode to Coldmore a week before the ceremony. She wanted time, not for preparation in the formal sense, because the ceremony was simple and required almost nothing in the way of preparation. She wanted time to be in the place, doing the work in the days leading up to it. She did not want the ceremony to feel like a break from her life. She wanted it to be a continuation of it. She worked. She did rounds at the camp with Nell, who had come with her from the station. Lily was staying to manage the daily work, and Nell had come because she was going to be a recognized field healer in the outer territory network, and her presence at this gathering mattered for what it said about the station and the work it produced. Nell had looked at everything, the road, the territories, the camp, the network of people who existed in relationship to Seraphine, with the particular quality of attention she brought to new information, which was total and unashamed. She asked her 900 questions on the road and then settled into the camp as if she had always been there, which was the quality Seraphine had recognized in her from the beginning. She was the right person for the work. On the third evening before the ceremony, Bram came to find Seraphine where she was sitting at the supply table, reviewing the new trade route documentation with Colt's representative. Bram said, "The king is here." Seraphine looked up. Bram said, in the manner of someone who is offering information and also an opinion on that information simultaneously. "He came without the formal escort, just the one aide. He's staying at the outer Wayfarers station." She said, "I see." Bram waited a moment. She said, "You didn't invite him." "No," Seraphine said, "he invited himself, that's his to decide." She looked at Bram. "Is he causing any difficulty?" Bram said, "No. He's been useful with the supply crates, apparently." This was delivered with the particular flatness of someone who is willing to credit a fact without endorsing the person it applies to. Seraphine said, "All right." She went back to the documentation. Bram watched her for a moment, then left. That night she went to the Wayfarers station. Not because she had decided something. Because she had decided she was ready to have the conversation she had been deferring since the road to Coldmoor, which was really the same conversation she had been holding at arm's length for 7 years, and which was not going to benefit from additional deferral. He was outside the station when she arrived, sitting on an overturned log near the fire, doing nothing in particular. He looked up when he heard her. She sat down on the other side of the fire. She said, "You're here." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because the ceremony is something I should witness, not as an authority, as a witness." She thought about this. She said, "And?" He looked at her across the fire. He said, "And because I wanted to be near this, near what you've built. I understand I have no right to it. I understand it belongs to you entirely and to the people here, but I wanted to be close enough to see it clearly." She said, "Sit with that for a moment without filling it." He was quiet. She said, "When you didn't speak in that dining room, 7 years ago. When Goran made the comment about the vain name." He said, "Yes." She said, "What was happening for you in that moment?" He was quiet for longer this time. He said, "I was calculating whether the political cost of speaking outweighed the social cost of not speaking. I was doing the arithmetic the way I always did the arithmetic." She said, "And what was the result?" He said, "I told myself it would be worse to make it larger by responding. I told myself you had handled it and it was resolved." He looked at her. "I knew in the same moment that this was not what you needed. I knew, and I made the other choice." She held this. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you were easier to cost." This sat in the air between them. The fire moved. She said, "Yes." He said, "There is nothing I can offer for that, I know it. I'm not offering it to receive something in return. I'm saying it because it is the true account and you deserve the true account." She said, "I know what I deserved." She looked at the fire. "I also know what I've had, which was 7 years of building something real, and I am not going to tell you that had no cost, because it did. And I'm also not going to tell you I would undo it, because I wouldn't." She looked at him. She said, "I have not decided what I want from this. From whatever this is between us now, I want you to understand that is genuine. It is not strategy. It is not withholding. I genuinely don't know yet." He said, "I know." She said, "But I'm willing to find out." He looked at her. She saw in his face something that was not relief. Relief would have been too simple, and they were both too clear-eyed for it, but something that was perhaps the first honest response she had ever received from him. Not managed, not calculated, just present. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me, it's not a gift, it's an inquiry." He almost smiled. It was a careful thing, barely visible, but it was there. She stood up. She said, "The ceremony is at noon. Be in the back, not the front." He said, "Yes." She walked back to the camp. The night was cold and clear, and the stars over the outer territories were the kind of stars you only saw this far from palace lights, thick and immediate and close enough to feel like they were meant for you specifically. She walked and looked at them and thought, this is the night before, and tomorrow it becomes official, which is different from real. It has been real for a long time. She had a ceremony in the morning. She had work in the afternoon. She had a station to return to and 3 months of implementation work ahead of her, and a conversation with a man by a fire that she was going to sit with and see what it became. She had Nell, who would be a great healer. She had Lily, who had opened a door and made soup. She had Bram, who shook your hand like grabbing a tree root and meant it. She had Nora, who had stood up in a procedural session when she didn't have to. She had her mother's boots on her feet, and her mother's ring on her hand, and 7 years of roads in her feet, and the bond running quiet and present at the edge of her awareness like a heartbeat, which was what it had always been, and which she had learned over time was not a trap. She reached the camp, she went to her shelter, she sat on the edge of the cot. She did not write in the journal tonight. There was nothing left to work out in writing. Everything was where it needed to be. She lay down. She slept. The morning came clean and cold and bright, which was what mornings did in the outer territories, without apologizing for the temperature, without softening the light. She rose and dressed in the same clothes she wore for work. She had been offered formal dress for the ceremony and had declined, because she was not being installed as a figurehead, and she was not going to arrive at her own ceremony dressed like one. She ate breakfast with Nell at the campfire. Nell was quiet, which was unusual for Nell, and she understood that Nell was feeling the weight of the occasion, and she let her feel it without trying to lighten it. The pack representatives began arriving at mid-morning. From Grayfen, Bram and 2 senior members. From Ashfin, Colt and the young representative who had been at the signing. From Coldmore, the elder and 5 community members. From the other territories connected through the network, representatives who had come because the word had gone out, and they understood what this gathering meant. Nell at one point looked around the assembly and said quietly to Seraphine, "All these people, did you know they were all going to come?" Seraphine said, "I knew some of them, others I didn't expect." Nell said, "They came because you're here." Seraphine said, "They came because the work is worth coming for." Nell thought about this. She said, "Both things are true." Seraphine looked at her. She said, "Yes, both things are true." At noon, the ceremony began. It was simple, which was what she had asked for and what the outer territories produced naturally, because they did not have the palace's appetite for elaborate performance. The senior representative from each territory spoke, briefly, about the specific work she had done in their territory and what it had meant. Bram spoke for Grayfen in the way Bram spoke for everything, directly and without softening, which meant what she said landed with the full weight of it. She said, "Seraphine came to Grayfen 7 years ago as someone who knew what she was doing. She came back 8 weeks ago as someone who had been doing it for 7 years. The difference between those 2 things is what this ceremony is about. You can't grant that to a person. You can only recognize it." She placed the formal mark of the High Luna title, a simple cord of 3 colors, one for each founding territory braided together around Seraphine's neck. Seraphine stood in the center of the assembly. She looked at the faces around her. She looked at Nell. She looked at Colt, whose expression was exactly as unreadable as it always was and whose presence here was its own form of endorsement. She looked at the Coldmore elder and the Ashfin young representative, and the people from the territories she had not yet visited but who had come anyway, because word traveled in the outer territories faster than official correspondence. She looked briefly at the back of the gathering, where a single figure stood at the edge of the circle, contained, present, not directing anything, witnessing. She met his eyes for one moment. She looked back at the assembly. She said, "I'm not going to make a speech." Several people laughed, which was the response she had intended. "What I want to say is this. What I've done here for 7 years, I've done with you, not for you. That distinction matters. I didn't come to the outer territories to rescue anything. I came because I needed somewhere to be useful, and you gave me that. Everything I've built here was built in relationship." The Coldmore Ashfin Accord, that was Coldmore and Ashfin telling me what they needed and trusting me to hear it accurately. The Grayfen water situation, that was Bram trusting me to show up. The station, that was Lily opening a door, every single thing. She let a moment settle. She said, "This title belongs to the work, and the work belongs to all of us, so thank you and let's get back to it." There was not applause exactly. There was something warmer than applause, the sound of a large group of people exhaling together and then beginning to talk, the way people talk when something has been officially confirmed that they already knew. Nell found her immediately after and stood beside her and did not say anything, which was, she had learned over 3 years, how Nell expressed the things that were too significant for 900 questions. Bram came next and shook her hand, tree root grip, and said, "Next supply run 2 weeks." She said, "I'll be there." Colt came and stood in front of her for a moment and said, "The accord is holding." He said nothing else. He walked away. This was Colt's highest form of endorsement. Later, much later, when the gathering had shifted into the more ordinary rhythm of a camp where people were eating and talking and the serious business had been done, she found herself standing apart for a few minutes, looking at the territory, the hills, the open sky. She heard steps behind her. She did not need to turn to know. She said, "It's a good view." He said, "Yes." She said, "Bram would say you carried supply crates." He said she would. She said, "Did you?" He said, "Yesterday, before you came to the Wayfarers station." She looked at the hills. She said, "What did you think of the ceremony?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I thought I should have understood earlier what this was, what she was." A pause. "I thought I understand it now." She said, "That's enough." He said, "Is it?" She said, "It's a start, which is what now is a start." She turned and looked at him. The light was going out of the afternoon, long and gold and thinning. She said, "I'm going back to the station for 3 weeks, then the first implementation review, then back to the station. This is what my life looks like." He said, "I know." She said, "And?" He said, "And I'd like to learn what that means in practice, what the days look like, what the work requires." He looked at her, "If that's permitted." She thought about it. She thought about the road to Coldmore and the fire at the Wayfarers station and the conversation she had waited 7 years to have, and the fact that it had in the end been honest. She thought about her mother's ring on her hand and the cord at her neck, and the faces of the people who had just stood in a circle and confirmed something that was already true. She said, "Come to the implementation review. Do the same thing you've been doing, observe, be useful when asked, don't direct anything." He said, "And after the review?" She said, "We'll see." He said, "All right." She said, "Go eat something. Bram's camp has better food than Wayfarers stations." He almost smiled again. This time it was slightly more visible. She walked back to the camp. The fire was bright. Nell was laughing at something the Coldmore young member had said. Bram was overseeing the food distribution with her usual expression of focused efficiency. The stars were beginning to appear at the eastern edge of the sky. She sat down beside the fire. She put her hands on her knees. She felt the cord at her neck, light and present. She felt the bond, running quiet and warm at the edge of things, which was what it had always been and which she now thought was perhaps what it had been trying to be all along, under all the years of distance and absence, simply present, waiting for both people to be ready. She was ready. She sat in the warmth of the fire and the company of the people she had built her life around, and she looked at the stars coming out one by one over the outer territories, and she thought, "This is what it is to be exactly where you are." The fire burned, the night deepened, the stars kept coming. She did not move. She did not need to. She was already home.